In the rolling hills of Missouri, where the prairie wind carries whispers of what was and what might yet be, some stories are born not from what the eyes can see, but from what the heart dares to feel. This is the tale of Jeremiah Hawthorne, a man who lost his sight to Confederate grape shot at Gettysburg, and Beatrice Morrison, a woman whose past was as hidden as the reasons that brought her to his door on that rain-soaked evening in 1873. Jeremiah Hawthorne had never seen the woman whose hands he held, and he never would. But for the first time since the war took his sight, Beatrice's voice brought him peace in the darkness. Her touch showed him a world more beautiful than any he'd ever imagined. Some folks said a blind man couldn't truly love a woman he'd never seen. They were wrong. Sometimes the heart sees what the eyes never could, and sometimes love is born not from sight, but from the gentle press of fingers and the whispered promises made in the dark. This is their story, a testament to the truth that real beauty isn't found in what we see, but in how we choose to love when the world tells us we cannot. The autumn rain drummed against the cabin roof like impatient fingers, each drop echoing through the small rooms where Jeremiah Hawthorne sat alone by his cold hearth. He counted the sounds now, had been counting them for 3 years since he'd returned from the war. The creak of settling timber, the whistle of wind through the gap beneath his door, the steady drip where his roof leaked into the tin bucket he'd placed by memory in just the right spot. 3 years since Gettysburg. 3 years since the world went dark forever. The knock at his door came soft at first, so gentle he almost mistook it for rain against wood. Then it came again, firmer, followed by a voice he'd never heard before. A woman's voice, clear and steady despite the tremor of cold that ran through it. "Please," she called through the storm. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but I saw your light. I need help." Jeremiah's hands found the arms of his chair, weathered fingers gripping wood worn smooth by years of use. Visitors were rare out here, 5 miles from the nearest town, and a woman traveling alone in weather like this. "Who's there?" he called, rising slowly. His bare feet found the familiar path across the floor, each board's creak and give as known to him as his own heartbeat. "My name is Beatrice Morrison. My wagon's stuck in the mud about a mile down your road. I've been walking for near an hour." Her voice carried exhaustion, but no fear, and something in its tone, honest, forthright, made him reach for the door latch. The wind caught the door as he opened it, driving rain across his face and into his cabin. But with the storm came her scent, lavender soap and wet wool, rain and something else, something warm and alive that spoke of kindness. "Lord have mercy," he said, stepping aside. "Come in, quickly now." She moved past him in a whisper of damp fabric, and he heard her soft gasp as the warmth of his cabin enveloped her. He closed the door against the storm and turned, wishing not for the first time that he could see the woman who'd brought such gentle disturbance to his solitude. "You're soaked through," he said, hearing the drip of water from her clothes to his floor. "There's a fire laid in the hearth. Let me light it." "I can manage," she said quickly. "You don't need to trouble yourself." But he was already moving toward the fireplace, his hands finding the matches on the mantel by long practice. The first match flared. He always knew by the sulfur smell and the sudden warmth against his fingers, and soon flames were licking at the kindling he'd prepared that morning. "Sit," he said, gesturing toward the chair closest to the fire. "You'll catch your death standing there in wet clothes." He heard the rustle of her skirts as she moved, the soft sigh as she settled into the chair. For a moment, the only sounds were the crackling fire and the storm outside. Then she spoke, and her voice held a note of wonder. "You did that like you could see every stick of wood." Jeremiah's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. 3 years of practice makes a man handy in the dark. There's coffee on the stove, made it this afternoon, and it's likely strong enough to float a horseshoe, but it's hot. "Coffee sounds like heaven," she said softly. He moved to the stove, muscle memory guiding him to the right pot, the clean cups hanging on their hooks, the sugar bowl with its chipped rim that caught his finger just so. As he poured, he found himself listening to her breathing, the small sounds she made as she warmed herself by the fire. There was something calming about her presence, something that eased the tight knot that had lived in his chest since he'd come home from the war. "Here," he said, extending the cup toward her voice. Her fingers brushed his as she took it, warm despite her ordeal, soft as flower petals. The touch lasted only a moment, but it sent an unexpected jolt through him. When had anyone last touched him with such gentle care? "Thank you," she murmured. "You're very kind." "Kindness is just good sense in weather like this," he said, settling into his own chair across from her. "Storm like this, nobody should be traveling alone. What brought you out in such weather, if you don't mind my asking?" There was a pause, long enough that he wondered if she'd answer. When she spoke, her voice was careful, measured. "I'm traveling to my cousin's place in Harmony. Family matter that couldn't wait for better weather. I thought I could make it before the worst of the storm hit, but I misjudged." Something in her tone suggested there was more to the story. But Jeremiah had learned in his years of darkness that sometimes the things people chose not to say were as important as the words they spoke. Everyone had their private sorrows, their hidden troubles. "Harmony's still a good 15 miles north," he said. "You won't be traveling anywhere tonight. Not in this storm. You're welcome to stay here until morning." "I couldn't impose—" "Ma'am," he interrupted gently, "out here offering shelter in a storm isn't an imposition. It's an obligation. I've got a spare room. Belonged to my sister before she married and moved to California. Clean bed, warm quilts. You'll be safe here." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney, and in the brief silence that followed, he heard her sigh, a sound that carried more weariness than any storm could cause. "You're very generous, Mr. Hawthorne." "Jeremiah Hawthorne." "Mr. Hawthorne, I'm grateful for your kindness." She paused, then asked softly, "Were you hurt in the war?" It was a question he'd grown used to, though it still caught him off guard sometimes. Most folks in these parts knew his story, the farm boy who'd marched off with the Missouri Volunteers and come home blind, but strangers still had to ask. "Gettysburg," he said simply. "Artillery shell. Could have been worse. I came home. A lot of good men didn't." "I'm sorry," she said, and there was something in her voice that told him she understood loss in a way that went beyond mere sympathy. "It's been 3 years," he said. "A man learns to adapt." "Still," she said quietly, "it must be hard. Managing a farm, living alone." He was quiet for a moment, listening to the storm and the fire, and the sound of her breathing in the chair across from him. How long had it been since he'd had a real conversation with someone? Since someone had sat in this room and made it feel less empty? "It is hard," he admitted, "but it's home, and a man makes do with what the Lord gives him." They talked through the evening as the storm raged outside, their conversation flowing as naturally as water finding its course. She told him about growing up in Ohio, about books she'd read and places she'd seen, about small kindnesses and simple joys. Her voice was like music to his ears, melodic, warm, with a hint of laughter always just beneath the surface. And when he finally showed her to the spare room, lighting a candle for her though he needed no light himself, her fingers brushed his again as she took it from him. "Good night, Jeremiah," she said softly. "Thank you for everything." "Good night, Beatrice," he replied, and found himself looking forward to morning in a way he hadn't in 3 long years. That night, as he lay in his own bed listening to the storm begin to ease, Jeremiah Hawthorne found himself wondering about the woman sleeping in his sister's old room. He thought about her voice, her gentle touch, the way she'd spoken to him, not with pity or awkward kindness, but as if he were simply a man worth talking to. He'd forgotten what that felt like. Morning came soft and gray, the storm having blown itself out sometime before dawn. Jeremiah woke to unfamiliar sounds, the gentle clatter of dishes, the whisper of skirts across his kitchen floor, the homey sound of someone preparing breakfast in his long, quiet house. For a moment, he lay still, listening. It had been so long since there had been life in these rooms, beyond his own careful movements. So long since the house had felt like anything more than a place to shelter from the world's indifference. He dressed quickly and made his way to the kitchen, guided by the scent of coffee and bacon and something sweet, biscuits maybe or pancakes. "Good morning," Beatrice's voice greeted him warmly. "I hope you don't mind. I took the liberty of making breakfast. I found eggs in your hen house and flour in your pantry." "You didn't need to do that," he said. though the truth was he couldn't remember the last time he'd smelled anything so good coming from his own kitchen. "It's the least I could do after your hospitality," she replied. "Please sit. Everything's ready." He settled into his usual chair at the small kitchen table, and a moment later heard the soft clink of a plate being set before him. The food was arranged just so. He could tell by the way his fork found each item exactly where he expected it to be. She'd watched him carefully enough the night before to understand how he navigated his world. "This is wonderful," he said after his first bite. The biscuits were light and fluffy, the bacon perfectly crisp. "You're a fine cook, Miss Morrison." "Beatrice, please," she said, and he heard her settling into the chair across from him. "And thank you. My mother taught me well before she passed." They ate in comfortable quiet, broken only by the gentle sounds of morning. Birds greeting the dawn, his rooster crowing in the distance, the soft whisper of wind through leaves still heavy with rain. It struck him how natural this felt, how right. Two people sharing a meal, sharing the morning quiet. "I should check on your wagon after breakfast," he said. "See what can be done about getting you on your way." There was a pause, then. "Actually, I was wondering, the wagon's old and not in the best condition. Even if we get it unstuck, I'm not sure it'll make it all the way to Harmony. And with winter coming on—" She trailed off, and he waited, sensing there was more she wanted to say. "What I mean is," she continued carefully, "you mentioned managing the farm alone is difficult. I have some experience with household management, with cooking and mending and such. If you'd be willing to let me stay on for a while, just until spring perhaps, I could earn my keep by helping around the place." Jeremiah set down his fork, his mind racing. Part of him wanted to say yes immediately. The house already felt more alive with her in it, and the practical benefits of having help with the domestic work would be considerable. But another part of him hesitated. What did he know about this woman, really? And what would people say about a single man and woman living under the same roof? "Beatrice," he said slowly, "I appreciate the offer, but folks around here, well, they talk. A single man and woman sharing a house." "I've been thinking about that too," she said quickly. "What if we were to present ourselves as, well, as if you'd hired me as your housekeeper? Properly, I mean, with clear understanding that everything would be respectable and above board." He could hear the hope in her voice, carefully controlled but unmistakable. Whatever her reasons for wanting to stay, they went beyond simple convenience. "May I ask," he said gently, "why you're so eager to avoid going to your cousin's place? If that's not too personal a question?" Another pause, longer this time. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, vulnerable in a way it hadn't been before. "My cousin's husband, he's not a kind man. He drinks, and when he drinks, he has a heavy hand. I stayed with them for a few months after my parents died, and I can't go back to that. I'd rather take my chances on my own than live in fear again." The words hit Jeremiah like a physical blow. He thought of this gentle woman, for he could hear the gentleness in everything she did. Living in fear, subjected to violence. His hands clenched involuntarily. "Then you'll stay," he said firmly. "We'll work out the details, but you'll stay as long as you need to." "Thank you," she whispered, and he heard the relief in her voice like a prayer answered. The morning passed quickly as they worked together to assess the situation with her wagon. Jeremiah hitched up his own horses and, following Beatrice's directions, found the stuck vehicle about a mile down the muddy road. It was old as she'd said, and the storm had revealed several places where the wood was rotting through. "It's not worth salvaging," he said, running his hands over the damaged frame, "but we can get your belongings out of it." "There isn't much," she said quietly. "A trunk with my clothes, a few books, some personal things. Everything I have left fits in that trunk." Something in her voice made him want to comfort her, to tell her that material possessions didn't matter, that she was worth more than whatever she'd lost. Instead, he simply helped her gather her things, his hands occasionally brushing hers as they worked together to secure her belongings. Back at the house, she insisted on cooking lunch, and afterward they settled into a routine that felt surprisingly natural. She worked in the kitchen while he tended to the animals and the outdoor chores, but she asked questions about everything: how he managed tasks without sight, what his daily routine was like, what needed doing around the farm. The garden's been sadly neglected, he admitted as they walked the path between the house and barn. I can manage the basics, but I can't see the weeds taking over or tell when the vegetables are ripe. I love gardening, she said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. My mother had the most beautiful garden in our town. She taught me which plants grow well together, how to tell when things are ready to harvest. As the afternoon wore on, Jeremiah found himself marveling at how easily Beatrice adapted to his world. She didn't hover or coddle, didn't try to do everything for him. Instead, she seemed to understand instinctively that he needed to maintain his independence while appreciating the areas where help would be truly useful. When they worked side by side in the barn, feeding the animals and mucking stalls, she would quietly describe things he couldn't see. A bird building its nest in the rafters, the way the afternoon light slanted through the door, the contented expression on his old milk cow's face. She likes you, Beatrice said as the cow mooed softly at her approach. Bessie likes anyone who brings her grain, Jeremiah replied, but he smiled as he said it. No, it's more than that. She trusts you. Animals can sense things about people, can't they? They know when someone has a gentle heart. Her words warmed him in a way he hadn't expected. When had anyone last said he had a gentle heart? That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Beatrice asked if she might read aloud. I brought a few books with me, she said. I thought, well, it might be nice to share them. I'd like that, he said, settling back in his chair. It's been a long time since I've heard a story. She began to read from a volume of poems by Walt Whitman, her voice bringing the words to life in a way that painted pictures more vivid than any his eyes had ever seen. As she read, he found himself watching her voice, following its rhythms and inflections, learning the sound of her laughter when she came to something particularly beautiful or moving. Listen to this one, she said, and began to read. I believe a leaf of grass is no less than the journey work of the stars, and the pismire is equally perfect, and a grain of sand, and the egg of the wren, and the tree toad is a chef d'oeuvre for the highest, and the running blackberry would adorn the parlors of heaven. That's beautiful, Jeremiah said when she finished. He sees the divine in everything, doesn't he? Even the smallest things. Yes, she said softly. I think sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones we might overlook if we're not paying attention. Something in her tone made him think she wasn't just talking about poetry, and he felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. Later, as he lay in bed listening to the quiet sounds of Beatrice moving around in the kitchen, washing the dishes, banking the fire for the night, Jeremiah realized something had shifted in his world. For 3 years, he'd been existing rather than living, getting through each day without much thought for the next. But tonight, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow, wondering what new discoveries it might bring. The woman sleeping in his sister's room was changing everything, and for the first time since he lost his sight, that didn't frighten him. 2 weeks passed, like pages turning in a well-loved book, each day bringing small discoveries and quiet revelations. Jeremiah learned that Beatrice hummed while she worked, soft, wordless melodies that filled the house with music. He learned that she had opinions about everything from the best way to preserve tomatoes to the possibility of women someday getting the vote, and that she wasn't shy about sharing those opinions. He learned that her hands were gentle but capable, that she could milk Bessie faster than he could, mend his shirts with tiny perfect stitches, and coax his neglected garden back to life with a patience that bordered on miraculous. What he didn't learn was why she sometimes went quiet in the middle of a conversation, as if a shadow had passed over her thoughts. He didn't understand why she never received any mail, never mentioned friends or family beyond the cousins she was so desperate to avoid. And he couldn't quite figure out why someone with her obvious intelligence and capabilities had been traveling alone with everything she owned, packed into a single trunk. It was a Tuesday morning, crisp with the promise of winter, when he began to understand that Beatrice Morrison carried secrets heavier than any trunk. They were working together in the barn, Jeremiah mucking stalls while Beatrice organized the collection of tools that had grown chaotic over his years of solitary management. She was telling him about a book she'd read, something about a woman who'd disguised herself as a man to become a doctor, when the sound of approaching horses interrupted her mid-sentence. Jeremiah paused, listening. 2 horses, moving at a steady pace but not hurried. Visitors were still rare enough to be noteworthy. "Someone's coming," he said, setting aside his pitchfork. I'll just stay here," Beatrice said quickly. "Help you finish with the stalls." Something in her voice, a tightness that hadn't been there moments before, made him pause. "Beatrice, is everything all right?" "Of course," she said, but he could hear her moving deeper into the barn, as if trying to make herself invisible. The horses drew closer, then stopped in his yard. Jeremiah heard the creak of leather as someone dismounted, then footsteps approaching the barn. "Jeremiah, you in there?" He recognized the voice. Tom Bradley, who owned the spread 3 miles to the east. A good neighbor, though they didn't visit often. "In here, Tom," Jeremiah called, walking toward the barn door. Behind him, he could hear Beatrice's breathing, quick and shallow. Tom appeared in the doorway, his bulk blocking out some of the morning light. "Morning, Jeremiah. Thought I'd stop by, see how you're getting on." "Well enough," Jeremiah replied. "What brings you out this way?" "Well, that's an interesting question." Tom's voice carried a note of curiosity that put Jeremiah on edge. "Been hearing some interesting stories in town. Folks saying you've got yourself a housekeeper now." Jeremiah felt his shoulders tense. He'd known this conversation would come eventually. In a community as small as theirs, nothing stayed secret for long. "That's right," he said carefully. "Miss Morrison's been helping around the place." "Miss Morrison, is it?" Tom stepped further into the barn, and Jeremiah heard his boots scuffing against the straw-covered floor. "Funny thing, though, I was talking to Sheriff Hayes yesterday, and he mentioned getting a wire from up Kansas way. Seems there's a woman missing from Topeka, young lady named Beatrice Morrison. Family's been looking for her for near on 2 months now." The silence that followed was so complete that Jeremiah could hear his own heartbeat. Behind him, Beatrice had gone completely still. "Now, I'm not one to meddle in other folks' business," Tom continued, "but the description matches pretty well. About 25 years old, brown hair, traveling alone. Left Topeka sudden-like, without telling anyone where she was headed." Jeremiah's mind raced. 2 months would put her disappearance right around the time she'd shown up at his door. But if she'd lied about where she was from, what else had she lied about? "I appreciate your concern, Tom," he said carefully, "but I'm sure there's some mistake. Miss Morrison's from Ohio originally, traveling to visit family." "Maybe so," Tom said, but his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. "Still, might be worth having the sheriff come out, just to clear things up. Wouldn't want you harboring a runaway or anything like that." "That won't be necessary," Jeremiah said firmly. "I'll vouch for Miss Morrison's character myself." Tom was quiet for a moment, then chuckled. "You always were stubborn as a mule, Jeremiah. Just be careful is all I'm saying. Sometimes folks ain't what they seem." After Tom left, Jeremiah stood in the barn doorway for a long moment, listening to the sound of his horse's hoofbeats fading into the distance. Behind him, Beatrice hadn't moved or spoken. Finally, he turned back toward the barn. "Beatrice." "I'm here," she said quietly. He walked toward her voice, found her sitting on a bale of hay in the far corner of the barn. Even without seeing her, he could sense her distress. It radiated from her like heat from a forge. "Is it true?" he asked gently. "Are you from Topeka?" A long pause, then. "Yes." "And you've been missing for 2 months?" "Not missing. Gone. There's a difference." He settled onto another bale of hay, close enough that he could hear her breathing, but far enough away that he wouldn't crowd her. "What happened, Beatrice? What made you run?" For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet, he had to strain to hear it. "I was married," she said, "to a man named Charles Morrison. He was supposed to be a good match. My father thought so anyway. Charles was wealthy, respectable, well-connected in Topeka society." She paused, and Jeremiah heard her take a shaky breath. "He was also cruel, not in ways that showed, at least not at first. He was careful about that. But behind closed doors," her voice trailed off. Jeremiah felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same rage he'd felt when she told him about her cousin's husband. How many men thought they had the right to hurt women simply because they were stronger? "What happened 2 months ago?" he asked gently. "I lost a baby," she said, so quietly he almost didn't hear her. I was about 4 months along and I lost it. Charles said it was my fault, that I was too weak, too defective to give him the son he wanted. He said, she stopped as if unable to continue. You don't have to tell me, Jeremiah said softly. He said he was going to send me away. She continued anyway, her voice gaining strength as if telling the story was helping her reclaim it. To an asylum. He'd already spoken to a doctor about it, had papers drawn up declaring me mentally unstable, said no one would question it. A woman who couldn't even carry a child to term was obviously defective. Jeremiah's hands clenched into fists. So you ran. I took what little money I'd managed to save, some clothes, and I left in the middle of the night. I've been traveling ever since, staying ahead of anyone who might be looking for me. The pieces were falling into place now, her reluctance to share details about her past, her desperation to avoid her cousin, her eagerness to stay at his farm rather than continue traveling. Beatrice, he said carefully, if you're still legally married. Charles can have his divorce, she said fiercely. I'll never go back to him. I'd rather die first. They sat in silence for a long while, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the barn. Animals shifting in their stalls, hay rustling in the breeze that came through the open door. Jeremiah thought about everything she'd told him, about the courage it must have taken to leave everything she'd known, rather than submit to a man who saw her as property to be discarded when she proved inconvenient. What do you want to do? He asked finally. I don't know, she admitted. I can't stay here if it's going to bring you trouble, but I don't know where else to go. Jeremiah stood up, brushing straw from his pants. He'd made his decision, and it felt as natural as breathing. You're not going anywhere, he said firmly. This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. Jeremiah, you don't understand. If Charles finds me, then he'll have to go through me first, Jeremiah said, and meant it. I may be blind, Beatrice, but I'm not helpless, and I'll be damned if I let anyone hurt you again. He heard her sharp intake of breath, then the rustle of her skirts as she stood up. A moment later, he felt her hand slip into his, the first time she'd reached for him rather than the other way around. Thank you, she whispered. Her hand was warm and soft and trembling slightly, and as he squeezed it gently, Jeremiah realized something that both thrilled and terrified him. What he felt for this brave, wounded woman was far more than protectiveness or simple kindness. He was falling in love with her. That night, after supper was cleared away and the evening chores were done, they sat by the fire as had become their custom. But instead of reading, Beatrice simply stared into the flames while Jeremiah listened to her breathing and thought about everything that had changed between them. Jeremiah, she said finally. Yes? What if Tom Bradley's right? What if the sheriff comes? What if Charles has offered a reward for my return? He turned toward her voice, wishing he could see her face, could offer her the comfort of his eyes as well as his words. Then we'll face it together, he said simply. But you should know, whatever comes, you're not alone anymore. Do you understand that? I think I'm beginning to, she said softly. And as the fire burned low and the night settled around them, Jeremiah Hawthorne realized that for the first time in his life, he had something worth fighting for that had nothing to do with himself. The days that followed Tom Bradley's visit carried a tension that neither Jeremiah nor Beatrice spoke about directly, but both felt. She jumped at unexpected sounds, a shutter banging in the wind, his rooster crowing too early, the distant sound of horses on the main road. He found himself listening more carefully, attuned to every shift in her mood, every catch in her breathing. But life on the farm continued, and in the rhythm of daily work, something deeper began to grow between them. It started with small things. The way Beatrice would guide his hand to show him a particularly fine tomato she'd picked, her fingers lingering against his longer than necessity required. The way Jeremiah would reach for her hand to help her down from the wagon, and how neither of them seemed eager to let go once she was safely on the ground. It was in the way she'd begun to describe things, not just practically, the milk buckets by your left foot, but beautifully, as if she understood that his world had grown richer, not poorer for being painted with words instead of sight. The sunset tonight is like honey poured over gold, she said one evening as they sat on the porch after supper. The whole sky is amber and rose, and the clouds look like they're on fire. Tell me about the moon, he said, settling back in his chair beside her. It's just rising over the eastern hills, still low and fat, like a pearl someone dropped in blue velvet. The light is so soft it makes everything look like it's been dusted with silver. Her voice was like music, painting pictures in his mind more vivid than any his eyes had ever captured. But more than that, he loved the way she shared these visions with him, as if his inability to see made the telling more precious rather than less. Beatrice, he said one evening as they worked together in the kitchen, she washing dishes while he dried them. What did you want to be? Before you married Charles, I mean. What did you dream about doing with your life? She was quiet for so long he thought she might not answer. When she spoke, her voice was wistful. I wanted to teach, she said. I loved learning, loved books and ideas and the way knowledge could open up the world. I thought maybe I could open a school for girls, teach them not just reading and arithmetic, but how to think for themselves, how to question the world around them. Why didn't you? She handed him another plate, her fingers brushing his as he took it. My father said teaching was fine for spinsters and widows, but a married woman's duty was to her husband and her home. Charles agreed, of course. He said he didn't want people thinking he couldn't provide for his wife. Jeremiah heard the old hurt in her voice, the dreams deferred and then discarded. You still could, teach, I mean. I'm 26 years old and technically still married to a man who's probably telling everyone I'm insane. Who would let me near their children? Someone who took the time to know you, he said firmly. Someone who could see past gossip to the person you really are. They finished the dishes in thoughtful silence. But later, as they sat by the fire, Beatrice pulled out one of her books, a collection of essays about education and women's rights. Would you like me to read some of this? She asked. It's probably too radical for most folks' taste, but I'd like that very much, he said. As she read about the importance of educating women not just to be better wives and mothers, but to be full participants in society, Jeremiah found himself thinking about the life Beatrice might have had if she'd been born in a different time, a different place. She would have been a wonderful teacher, he thought. She had the patience for it, the intelligence, the gift for making complex ideas clear and interesting. What are you thinking about? She asked, having noticed his silence. I'm thinking you would have made a remarkable teacher, he said. Your students would have been lucky to learn from you. Thank you, she said softly. That means more to me than you know. It was the following week, as they worked together to harvest the last of the garden before the first hard frost, that everything changed between them. Beatrice was picking the final tomatoes while Jeremiah pulled up the spent bean plants. The work was pleasant, companionable, filled with easy conversation about plans for next year's garden, speculation about when winter would truly arrive. Oh, Beatrice said suddenly, her voice filled with delight. Jeremiah, come feel this. He made his way over to where she was working, guided by her voice. What is it? Give me your hand, she said, and when he extended it, she placed his palm against something soft and vibrating. It took him a moment to realize what it was. A kitten, barely old enough to be away from its mother, purring against his hand. Where did it come from? He asked, gently stroking the tiny creature. I think it's been living under the porch, she said. I've heard scratching sounds the last few nights. It's so small, Jeremiah. I don't think it can survive the winter on its own. The kitten mewed pitifully, a sound so tiny and vulnerable that it went straight to his heart. Without thinking, he scooped it up, cradling it against his chest. We'll take care of you, he murmured to the kitten, feeling its tiny heartbeat against his fingers. We? Beatrice asked softly. The word had slipped out without thought, but as soon as she questioned it, Jeremiah realized how natural it felt. Not I, but we, as if they were truly a partnership, a family. If you want, he said, suddenly uncertain. I just meant, I want, she said quickly. I want very much to be we. They stood there in the garden, the late afternoon sun warm on their faces, sharing the care of something small and helpless. And Jeremiah felt something shift in his chest. The careful walls he'd built around his heart since the war, walls meant to protect him from disappointment, from the pain of wanting things he thought he couldn't have, began to crumble. Beatrice, he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Yes? I need to tell you something, and I need you to know I don't expect anything from you. I don't want you to feel obligated or uncomfortable or... Jeremiah, her voice was gentle, amused. Just tell me. He took a breath, still cradling the kitten. I'm falling in love with you. I think I've been falling in love with you since that first night you read to me by the fire. And I know I'm not much of a prospect, a blind farmer with more scars than sense, but I needed you to know. The silence that followed seemed to stretch forever. The kitten purred against his chest, and somewhere in the distance a crow called. But from Beatrice, there was only quiet. Then he felt her hand on his cheek, soft and warm and trembling slightly. Look at me, she said softly. Beatrice, I can't. Look at me with your heart, she whispered. Tell me what you see. He turned toward her voice, toward the warmth of her hand on his face. I see someone brave, he said slowly. Someone who left everything she knew rather than accept a life without hope. I see someone who makes me laugh, who reads to me like every word is a gift, who talks to my cow like she's an old friend. Her thumb traced across his cheekbone, and he heard her breath catch. I see someone who makes me want to be better than I am, he continued. Someone who makes me feel like maybe I'm not as broken as I thought. Someone who makes this old house feel like home again. And I see someone, she whispered, who offered shelter to a stranger in a storm. Someone who protected me when he barely knew me, who makes me feel safe for the first time in years. I see someone with the gentlest hands and the strongest heart I've ever known. She leaned closer, and he could feel her breath warm against his face. I love you too, Jeremiah Hawthorne, she said. I love you so much it scares me. When she kissed him, soft and tentative at first, then with growing certainty, Jeremiah felt the last of his walls crumble completely. This was what he'd been searching for without knowing it. Not just love, but belonging. Not just acceptance, but joy. The kitten mewed between them, and they broke apart laughing. I think someone's jealous, Beatrice said, and he could hear the smile in her voice. Can't blame him, Jeremiah said, gently stroking the kitten's tiny head. I wouldn't want to share you either. They went inside together, the kitten curled against Jeremiah's chest, Beatrice's hand tucked into his free arm. As they settled by the fire, Beatrice finding a basket and some soft cloths to make a bed for their unexpected guest, Jeremiah marveled at how perfectly right this felt. What will we call him? Beatrice asked, watching the kitten curl up in his makeshift bed. He's your foundling, Jeremiah said. You should name him. Hope, she said without hesitation. I want to call him Hope. That night, as they sat by the fire with Hope purring contentedly in his basket between them, Beatrice read from a book of love poems. Her voice was softer than usual, intimate, as if the words were meant only for him. Listen to this one, she said, and began to read. I love you without knowing how, or when, or from where. I love you simply without problems or pride. I love you like this because I don't know any other way to love. That's beautiful, Jeremiah said. Who wrote it? A poet named Pablo Neruda. It's translated from Spanish. She paused. It reminds me of us. This love that just is, without explanation or justification. Like it was always supposed to be this way, he agreed. Yes, like we were both just waiting, without even knowing what we were waiting for. Later, when they said goodnight outside her bedroom door, Jeremiah reached for her hand. Beatrice? You should know what I said earlier about not expecting anything. I know, she said softly. And you should know that when I'm ready, when I've healed enough from what Charles did to me, there's no one I'd rather give my heart to completely. I'll wait, he said simply. As long as you need. She stood on her toes and kissed his cheek. I know you will. That's part of why I love you. As he lay in bed that night, listening to the familiar sounds of his house settling around him, Jeremiah Hawthorne felt something he hadn't experienced since before the war. Perfect contentment. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. He knew Charles Morrison was still out there somewhere, that the sheriff might still come calling, that life on the frontier was never without its difficulties. But tonight, he was a man in love with a woman who loved him back. Tonight, the future looked brighter than it had in years, painted not with light he could see, but with hope he could feel. And in the basket by the fire, A tiny kitten named Hope purred in his sleep, as if he too knew that everything was going to be all right. Winter came early that year, sweeping down from the north with a vengeance that caught even the old-timers off guard. By December, snow lay thick across the Missouri hills, and the wind carried a bite that went straight through to the bone. But inside Jeremiah's cabin, warmth reigned, not just from the fire that Beatrice kept burning bright, but from the love that had grown between them like spring flowers blooming in impossible soil. They had settled into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Mornings found them working side by side, tending to the animals who depended on them for survival through the harsh months. Afternoons were for indoor tasks, Beatrice mending clothes while Jeremiah worked leather or carved tools, both of them talking about everything and nothing, while Hope the kitten, now grown fat and sleek, supervised from his favorite spot by the fire. Evenings belonged to books and quiet conversation, to the gentle intimacy of two people learning to love without reservation. Beatrice still slept in the spare room, but the distance between them was measured not in walls, but in patience, the careful, tender waiting of two hearts that had found their match but were willing to let healing happen in its own time. It was on a particularly bitter night in late December when the past finally caught up with them. They were sitting by the fire, Beatrice reading aloud from a collection of Mark Twain stories while Jeremiah listened with the easy contentment that had become his natural state. Hope was purring in his lap, and the wind outside seemed like nothing more than nature's lullaby. Then came the sound that changed everything, the unmistakable thunder of multiple horses approaching at speed. Jeremiah's hand stilled on Hope's fur. Beside him, Beatrice's voice faltered mid-sentence. "How many?" she whispered. He listened carefully. 4, maybe 5. Moving fast. The horses didn't slow as they approached. Instead, they thundered into the yard and came to an abrupt halt, harness jingling, hooves stamping in the snow. Jeremiah heard the creak of leather as men dismounted, the low murmur of voices conferring. Then a voice he'd never heard before, but somehow knew instantly, called out across the yard. "Mrs. Morrison, I know you're in there. Come out now and we can settle this like civilized people." Beatrice's sharp intake of breath told Jeremiah everything he needed to know. Charles Morrison had found them. "Stay here," Jeremiah said quietly, setting Hope aside and rising from his chair. "No." Beatrice was on her feet too, her hand catching his arm. "Jeremiah, you don't understand. He's not alone, and he's not here to talk. All the more reason for you to stay inside. Jeremiah Hawthorne." The voice outside was closer now, right outside the door. "I know you're harboring my wife. Send her out, and maybe we can avoid any unpleasantness." Jeremiah moved to the door, Beatrice right behind him. Through the wood, he could hear several men breathing, stamping their feet against the cold. "There's no Mrs. Morrison here," Jeremiah called back. "Just me and my housekeeper." A low chuckle that held no humor. "Your housekeeper? Is that what you're calling her?" "Well, your housekeeper is a married woman, and she belongs with her husband." "I belong to no one," Beatrice said suddenly, her voice carrying clearly through the door. "Least of all you, Charles." "Beatrice." The voice turned honey-sweet, sickeningly familiar. "Come out here, darling. Let's go home and forget this whole unfortunate episode." "This is my home," she said firmly, "and I'm not going anywhere with you." The silence that followed was pregnant with menace. When Charles spoke again, all pretense of civility was gone. "Mr. Hawthorne, I'm going to give you one chance to step aside. My wife is legally my property, and I have every right to retrieve her. If you interfere, you'll be guilty of harboring a fugitive." Jeremiah's hand found the rifle that stood beside the door. "I'm afraid I disagree with your interpretation of the law. The lady has asked you to leave, and I'm going to have to insist you honor her wishes." "You're making a mistake," Charles said, his voice taking on a dangerous edge. "I have 4 armed men with me, and you're just one blind man protecting a woman who isn't even yours." "She's not yours either," Jeremiah replied steadily. "She's her own person, with the right to choose her own path." "How noble," Charles sneered. "Tell me, does she still wake up screaming from nightmares? Does she still flinch when you touch her? Did she tell you about the baby she lost because she was too weak to carry it?" Jeremiah felt Beatrice's sharp intake of breath, felt her waver beside him. Charles's words were designed to wound, to undermine, to make her feel small and broken. "What I know," Jeremiah said calmly, "is that she's the strongest, bravest woman I've ever met. And if you think I'm going to let you hurt her again, you're badly mistaken." "Enough talk," Charles snapped. "Boys, the door." The first assault came as a tremendous crash against the wooden door. Jeremiah had built well, but 4 men with a makeshift ram could break through anything given enough time. The door shuddered, held, then shuddered again under a second impact. "The bedroom window," Jeremiah said quickly. "Can you get out that way?" "I'm not leaving you," Beatrice said fiercely. "You have to. If they get their hands on you—" "No." Her voice was steel. "I've run enough. This ends here." The door was beginning to splinter. Jeremiah cocked his rifle, moved to position himself between Beatrice and whatever was coming. "Behind the table," he ordered. "Stay low." The door gave way on the fourth impact, bursting inward in a shower of broken wood and twisted metal. Cold air rushed in, along with the sound of boots on his floor. "There she is," Charles's voice was triumphant. "Come along, darling. Time to go home." "Stay back," Jeremiah warned, raising his rifle toward the sound of approaching footsteps. "You won't shoot," Charles said confidently. "You can't even see us. You might hit your precious Beatrice by mistake." It was a calculated cruelty, meant to paralyze him with doubt. But Charles had underestimated both Jeremiah's skill and his determination. 3 years of blindness had taught him to navigate by sound, and he could track every movement in his small cabin with perfect precision. "I know exactly where you are," Jeremiah said quietly, "and I know exactly where she is. Care to test my aim?" "Boys," Charles said, and Jeremiah heard the whisper of guns being drawn. What happened next unfolded in seconds that felt like hours. Jeremiah heard the distinctive click of a hammer being cocked to his left, spun toward the sound, and fired. A man screamed. Something heavy hit the floor. Chaos erupted. More gunshots, the crash of furniture being overturned, Beatrice crying out his name. Jeremiah worked the bolt of his rifle by feel, pivoted toward another sound, fired again. But there were too many of them, and in the confined space of the cabin, his advantage was limited. A blow to his shoulder sent him stumbling, and he felt the rifle torn from his hands. "Enough!" Charles's voice cut through the noise. "Tie him up. We're taking both of them." "No!" Beatrice's voice was pure fury. "Leave him alone!" Jeremiah felt rough hands on his arms, rope being wrapped around his wrists. But even as they bound him, he could hear Beatrice fighting, the sound of a slap, her cry of pain and rage, the scuffle of boots as she struggled against her captors. "Don't hurt her," he said, his voice carrying all the authority he could muster despite his helpless position. "I don't want to hurt her," Charles said reasonably. "I just want to take my wife home. But if she keeps fighting, well, sometimes a man has to be firm with his property." "I am not your property," Beatrice spat. "Oh, but you are, darling. The law is very clear on that point. A wife belongs to her husband, just like any other asset. And you've been very naughty running away like this." Jeremiah tested his bonds, found them expertly tied. But even trussed up and disarmed, he wasn't helpless. He had one weapon left, his voice and the truth it could carry. "Tell me, Morrison," he said conversationally, "do your men know what kind of man they're working for? Do they know you like to hit women? Do they know you were planning to have your own wife committed to an asylum?" "Shut up," Charles snapped. "Do they know she lost your baby because you beat her? Do they know?" The blow caught him across the face, snapping his head back and filling his mouth with blood. But it was worth it to hear the murmur of unease from Charles's men. "Is that true, boss?" one of them asked. "About the woman?" "What I do with my wife is none of your concern," Charles said coldly. "Maybe not," the man replied slowly, "but I got a wife of my own. And sisters. Don't seem right, beating on a woman." "You're paid to follow orders, not to have opinions," Charles snarled. "Maybe," the man said again, "but maybe some orders ain't worth following." In the tense silence that followed, Jeremiah heard the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked, but not by Charles or his remaining loyal men. "I suggest," said a new voice, calm and measured, that everyone put their weapons down nice and slow. Sheriff Hayes. Tom Bradley must have seen the riders heading this way and gone for help. Sheriff, Charles said, his voice switching instantly to injured righteousness. Thank God you're here. This man has been holding my wife against her will. That's so? Hayes replied dryly. Because from what I can see, you're the one doing the holding, and breaking and entering, and assault. I have every legal right. You have the right to remain silent, Hayes interrupted. I suggest you use it. What followed was a confusion of voices. The sheriff taking control, Charles protesting his rights, Beatrice's quiet sobs of relief. Jeremiah felt the ropes being cut from his wrists, felt gentle hands helping him to his feet. You all right, son? Sheriff Hayes asked. I'll live, Jeremiah replied, working feeling back into his hands. Beatrice. I'm here, she said, and then she was in his arms, shaking but whole. As Charles and his remaining men were led away in chains, the sheriff stayed behind to take statements and assess the damage. The door would need to be replaced, and there were bullet holes in the walls, but the structure was sound. This won't be the end of it, Hayes warned. Morrison's got money, connections. He'll fight this in court, claim he was just trying to retrieve his lawful wife. Then we'll fight back, Jeremiah said simply, his arm around Beatrice's shoulders. It won't be easy. The law's not on your side when it comes to marriage rights. Maybe not, Beatrice said quietly, but the truth is, and sometimes that's enough. Late that night, after the sheriff had gone and they'd done what they could to secure the broken door, Jeremiah and Beatrice sat by the rebuilt fire. Hope purred in Beatrice's lap, seemingly untroubled by the evening's violence. I'm sorry, she said quietly. I brought this to your door. You could have been killed because of me. No, Jeremiah said firmly, reaching for her hand. This happened because Charles Morrison is a coward and a bully. None of it was your fault. Still, you're exactly where you belong, and I'd fight a dozen Charles Morrisons to keep you here. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers intertwined with his. Jeremiah, what that man said tonight, about me flinching when you touch me, about the nightmares. What about it? It's not true anymore. I used to flinch, used to wake up afraid, but not with you. Never with you. He brought her hand to his lips, kissed her knuckles gently. I'm glad. What I'm trying to say is, I'm ready. For all of it. For marriage, for being your wife in every way. If you'll have me. Jeremiah turned toward her, his heart suddenly racing. Beatrice, I know we can't legally marry until the divorce is final, but we could have a ceremony anyway. Pastor Williams would understand, I think. We could be married in the eyes of God and our community, even if the law doesn't recognize it yet. Are you sure? There's no hurry, no pressure. I'm sure, she said firmly. I love you, Jeremiah Hawthorne. I want to be your wife, your partner, your family. I want to build a life with you that's ours, not something we're hiding from or apologizing for. He cupped her face in his hands, marveling as always at the softness of her skin, the warmth of her breath against his fingers. Then marry me, he said simply. Tomorrow, next week, whenever you want. Marry me and let the whole world know you're mine and I'm yours. When she kissed him this time, it was with a passion and certainty that took his breath away. This wasn't the tentative affection of two people learning to trust each other. This was the claiming kiss of a woman who knew her own mind and heart. Soon, she whispered against his lips. Very soon. As they sat together by the fire, planning their wedding and their future, Jeremiah reflected on the strange turns life could take. 3 years ago, he'd thought his story was over, that a blind man had nothing to offer the world, no hope of love or family or real happiness. Now he knew better. Sometimes the greatest gifts came wrapped in the most unexpected packages. Sometimes love found you not when you were strong and whole, but when you were broken and healing. Sometimes the eyes of the heart could see more clearly than any physical sight. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, a woman would knock on your door in a storm and change everything forever. Spring came to Missouri like a promise kept, washing away the last traces of the harsh winter that had tested them all. The snow melted into rushing creeks, the first green shoots pushed through the dark earth, and the air carried the sweet scent of reborn life. For Jeremiah and Beatrice, it felt like a new beginning in every possible way. The legal battle with Charles Morrison had been swift and decisive. Faced with charges of breaking and entering, assault, and attempted kidnapping, Charles had agreed to an uncontested divorce rather than face trial. Sheriff Hayes later told them privately that two of Charles's own men had testified against him, disgusted by what they'd witnessed in the cabin that night. Sometimes, the sheriff had said with satisfaction, justice does win out. The divorce papers had arrived on a Thursday morning in early April, along with a letter from Charles's attorney stating that Mr. Morrison would make no further claim on Mrs. Morrison's person or property. Beatrice had held the documents with shaking hands, reading them 3 times before she believed they were real. "It's over," she'd whispered. "It's really over." "No," Jeremiah had corrected gently, taking the papers from her trembling fingers. "It's just beginning." They were married on the first Saturday in May, in a ceremony that was simple, perfect, and attended by half the county. Pastor Williams performed the service on the front porch of their cabin, with the spring garden in full bloom behind them and the rolling hills of Missouri stretching away into the distance. Beatrice wore a dress of sky blue cotton that she'd sewn herself, with white wildflowers in her hair that she'd picked that morning. Jeremiah wore his best Sunday suit, the one he'd bought years ago for church, but had never had occasion to wear for joy. When Pastor Williams asked if he took this woman to be his lawfully wedded wife, Jeremiah's voice rang out clear and strong. "I do with all my heart." And when Beatrice promised to love, honor, and cherish him for as long as they both should live, her voice carried a certainty that left not a dry eye among the gathered witnesses. "You may kiss your bride," Pastor Williams said with a smile. And when Jeremiah leaned down to find Beatrice's lips, the cheer that went up from their friends and neighbors could be heard 3 counties over. Tom Bradley, who had become one of their staunchest supporters after witnessing Charles Morrison's true nature, stepped forward with a grin. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said formally, "welcome to the family." The reception that followed was a true frontier celebration, with music and dancing, and enough food to feed an army. Someone had brought a fiddle, and couples spun around the cleared space in front of the cabin, while children ran laughing through the crowd, and the women gossiped about what a perfect match the newlyweds made. "They say love is blind," old Mrs. Patterson remarked to her daughter, "but those two see each other clearer than most folks with perfect sight." As the evening wore on and the guests began to drift home, Jeremiah and Beatrice found themselves alone on their porch, watching the last of the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and rose. "Happy?" Jeremiah asked, his arm around his wife's waist. "More than I ever thought possible," Beatrice replied, leaning into his warmth. I feel like the luckiest man alive," he said simply. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the evening sounds of their farm, the lowing of cattle, the soft clucking of chickens settling for the night, the rustle of wind through the new leaves of their oak tree. "Jeremiah," Beatrice said finally, "do you ever wonder what our children will think? About us, I mean. About how we met, how we fell in love?" His heart skipped a beat. "Are you telling me something, Mrs. Hawthorne?" She laughed, a sound like silver bells in the twilight. "Not yet, but someday I hope. And when that day comes, I want them to know the whole story. How their father was the bravest, kindest man in Missouri, and how their mother was lucky enough to find shelter in his storm." "I think you've got that backwards," Jeremiah said softly. "You were the one who brought light into my darkness." "Then we saved each other," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "And that's what we'll tell them, that love isn't about being perfect or having everything figured out. It's about finding someone who sees your heart, even when your eyes can't show the way." That night, as man and wife for the first time, they discovered that love indeed had its own language, one written in whispered words and gentle touches, in the trust that comes from knowing someone completely, in the joy of 2 hearts beating in perfect rhythm. And in the months that followed, as they settled into married life, with the easy contentment of 2 people who had found their perfect match, their love continued to grow and deepen in ways that surprised them both. Beatrice did indeed prove to be a gifted teacher. When the county school board came looking for someone to manage the small schoolhouse in the neighboring town, she volunteered without hesitation. 3 days a week, she taught reading, writing, and arithmetic to children ranging in age from 6 to 16, and her reputation for both competence and compassion spread quickly throughout the region. She doesn't just teach them facts, one grateful parent told Jeremiah. She teaches them to think, to question, to believe in themselves. My daughter comes home talking about becoming a doctor or a lawyer, things I never would have thought possible for a girl. Jeremiah, meanwhile, had found his own calling. Word of the blind farmer who could outwork most sighted men had spread, and soon he was receiving visits from other veterans struggling with their own disabilities. Men who had lost limbs, who suffered from the invisible wounds of war, who felt useless and forgotten by a world that had moved on without them. To each of them, Jeremiah offered the same thing Beatrice had given him, the belief that their lives still had value, that they could still contribute, still love and be loved. The darkness isn't the end, he would tell them. It's just a different way of seeing. And sometimes, if you're open to it, you can see things in the dark that you never could in the light. On their first wedding anniversary, Beatrice had wonderful news to share. As they sat by the fire after a perfect May evening, she took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "Our first child," she whispered, "due around Christmas." Jeremiah's eyes filled with tears of pure joy. "Are you sure?" Dr. Peterson confirmed it yesterday. "A Christmas baby, Jeremiah. Our own little miracle." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of spun glass. "I love you," he whispered fiercely. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "And I love you," she replied, her own voice thick with emotion, "more than all the stars you can't see, but know are there." Their son was born on December 23rd, during the first snow of winter. Pastor Williams, who had become not just their minister, but their friend, declared it the most appropriate birth timing he'd ever witnessed. "A child born in winter to parents who found each other in a storm," he said, cradling the baby while Jeremiah sat beside Beatrice's bed, his hand in hers. "Seems to me this little one was always meant to be." They named him Thomas, after Jeremiah's father, who had died when Jeremiah was young. And from the moment he drew his first breath, it was clear that he had inherited the best of both his parents. His mother's curiosity and his father's steady strength, his mother's gentle nature and his father's determination. "What does he look like?" Jeremiah asked, running his finger along his son's tiny cheek. "Perfect," Beatrice said softly. "He has your strong chin and my stubborn nose, and the most beautiful eyes. They're going to be brown like yours, I think." "And he can see?" Jeremiah asked, the question that had haunted him throughout Beatrice's pregnancy. "He can see everything," she assured him. "He's already looking around like he wants to take in the whole world at once." As Thomas grew from baby to toddler to young boy, he became the bridge between his parents' worlds. He would describe everything to his father in the vivid, precise language that Beatrice had taught him, serving as Jeremiah's eyes while learning from him the patience and attention to detail that comes from navigating the world through senses other than sight. "Papa," he would say at age 4, tugging on Jeremiah's sleeve, "the sunset tonight looks like God spilled paint across the sky. Mama says it's purple and orange and gold, but I think it looks like magic." "Tell me more about the magic," Jeremiah would encourage, and Thomas would launch into elaborate descriptions that painted pictures more beautiful than any artist could capture. 2 years later, their daughter Mary was born, followed 3 years after that by twins Samuel and Sarah. Each child brought their own gifts to the family, their own unique way of seeing and describing the world, their own special relationship with their father who saw them not with his eyes but with his heart. The farm prospered under their combined care. Beatrice's organizational skills and Jeremiah's hard work, combined with the help of their growing children, made them one of the most successful operations in the county. But more than financial success, they had built something precious and rare. A family bound not just by blood, but by love, respect, and the shared understanding that real strength comes from lifting each other up. Years passed like pages in a well-loved book, each one adding depth and richness to their story. Jeremiah's hair turned silver, and lines formed around Beatrice's eyes. Lines that spoke of laughter shared and sorrows halved, of a life lived fully and without regret. On their silver wedding anniversary, Surrounded by their children and grandchildren, they sat once again on the porch where they'd been married 25 years before. The oak tree had grown tall and strong, its branches offering shade to a new generation of hawthorns who played in its shadow. "Any regrets?" Beatrice asked, a tradition they'd maintained throughout their marriage. "Only one," Jeremiah said, his arm around his wife of a quarter century. "Oh, I wish I could have seen your face the day we met. Just once." Beatrice was quiet for a moment. Then she took his hand and placed it gently on her cheek, as she had so many times over the years. "What do you see now?" she asked softly. Jeremiah's fingers traced the familiar lines of her face, the curve of her cheek, the softness of her skin, the small scar near her temple from a childhood accident she'd told him about years ago. "I see the most beautiful woman in the world," he said simply. "I see my wife, my partner, my best friend. I see love." "Then you see everything that matters," she replied, leaning into his touch. As the sun set over the Missouri hills on their anniversary evening, Jeremiah and Beatrice Hawthorne sat surrounded by the life they had built together. A life that proved beyond doubt that the greatest love stories aren't written by what the eyes can see, but by what the heart chooses to believe. Their grandson, Thomas Jr., was playing at their feet, building towers with wooden blocks that Jeremiah had carved for him. The boy looked up suddenly, his face bright with discovery. "Grandpa," he said excitedly, "I figured it out." "Figured what out, little man?" "Why you and Grandma love each other so much, even though you can't see her." Jeremiah smiled, ruffling the boy's hair. "And what did you figure out?" "Love doesn't need eyes," Thomas Jr. declared with the certainty that only a child can possess. "Love just needs hearts that match." From the mouths of babes, Jeremiah thought, pulling his wife closer as their family laughed and played around them. Love just needs hearts that match. And as the stars came out over their little piece of heaven, Jeremiah Hawthorne knew with absolute certainty that his heart had found its perfect match in the woman who had knocked on his door during a storm and changed his life forever. The darkness had never left him, but it no longer mattered. In Beatrice's love, in their children's laughter, in the life they had built together one day at a time, he had found all the light he would ever need. And so in these unforgiving lands where survival often meant choosing between your own needs and someone else's, Jeremiah and Beatrice chose love. They chose to see with their hearts when their eyes couldn't show the way. They chose to build rather than abandon, to trust rather than fear, to believe that sometimes the most beautiful gifts come wrapped in the most unexpected circumstances. Their love story reminds us that real beauty isn't found in what we can see, but in how we choose to love when the world tells us we cannot. That sometimes the greatest courage is simply opening your door when someone knocks in the storm. That family isn't just about blood, but about the daily choice to care for each other through whatever darkness may come. What would you have done if love had come to your door wearing the face of a stranger? If someone had asked you to believe in tomorrow when yesterday had taken everything you thought you needed to be whole? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, because out here, in these stories of grit and grace, every voice matters. Every heart that's ever felt broken, every soul that's ever dared to hope again, every person who's ever chosen love over fear has a place at this fire. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell, because there are still so many stories left to tell. Stories of courage in the face of impossible odds, of love that blooms in the harshest soil, of ordinary people who do extraordinary things simply because it's right. Until next time, remember, sometimes the greatest adventures begin not when we can see the path clearly, but when we're brave enough to step forward into the unknown, trusting that love will light the way. This is Wild West Stories. Thank you for riding along.